My name is Madeline Rhodes. I was born and raised in a quiet suburb just outside Asheville, North Carolina. From the outside, we looked like the portrait of a perfect middle-class American family, a quaint brick house with a lavender-lined driveway, a white picket fence, and cozy family dinners under warm golden light. But behind those walls, reality was far colder. I was the firstborn of Thomas and Caroline Rhodes, both self-proclaimed modern parenting experts. My father, a meticulous software engineer obsessed with logic and numbers, dreamed of raising a prodigy. My mother, she devoured more than 40 books on child psychology before I even took my first breath. I wasn't born. I was designed a project, an experiment, an ambition wrapped in a pink hospital blanket. By the time I turned 3 and still couldn't properly count to 20 or write my full name, their disappointment hardened into something almost palpable. "Thomas," my mother had said one evening, her voice low with a mixture of frustration and cold pragmatism. "I don't think she's capable of learning as fast as we hoped. We need to intervene early or we'll miss the golden stage." I still remember the way my father's eyes skimmed over me then, like a faulty equation he no longer cared to solve. And then, when I was 4 years old, Isabel Rhodes was born, and everything changed. Suddenly, the house transformed. Every corner burst with imported Montessori toys. Classical music played softly through speakers, hidden behind curtains, and charts of Isabel's developmental milestones were proudly pinned to the fridge like trophies. My childhood quietly shriveled up in the shadows. One afternoon, I sat building a small Lego castle in the corner of the living room. Savoring the few quiet moments I could still claim, Mom walked by, glanced at me, then let out a breathy sigh. "Isabel is only 7 months old and already responding to 3-step sequences," she said to no one in particular, casting a disappointed look at the blocks in my hands. "You never mind, keep playing." I wanted to disappear into the floor. Isabel had a musical high chair imported from Sweden, soft fabric books printed in French and Swedish, and a private Montessori tutor before she could even form full sentences. And me. I had faded workbooks from Walmart, a stubby pencil, and the daily reminder to try harder if you want to be anything. And as if the daily comparisons weren't enough, there were the grand displays, the ones that burned deeper. I still remember my 8th birthday vividly. The dining room was decorated with blue and silver streamers. A modest cake sat waiting, my name spelled carefully in sugary icing. For a moment standing there in front of the candles, I thought maybe today would be different. Maybe today I'd matter. As my mother clapped her hands to gather everyone around her, smile widened, not at me, but at Isabel, perched in a high chair babbling away. "Our little genius," she gushed to the guests. Just yesterday, Isabel read 50 new words all by herself. Gasps of admiration filled the room. The cake, the candles, even my own name felt irrelevant. I blew out the candles while no one was looking, my wish curling into smoke with the last fragile shred of hope I had. It was the first time I realized I wasn't growing up, I was disappearing. When I was 8, I won 2nd place in the school-wide art competition. I raced home, clutching my small painting, with a heart that still foolishly believed someone would care. Mom glanced at the certificate and offered a tight smile. "Well," she said, reaching for her phone, "Isabel read an entire short story today in English." Dad didn't even look up. He was too busy assembling a new logic puzzle board, another brain booster for Isabel. Praise, attention, pride, all of it flowed in one direction. I learned early not to expect anything, no applause, no warmth, no one saying, "You matter." I became a ghost in my own home, present breathing but never truly seen. The breaking point came the fall I turned 12. My room had always been the upstairs one, the one with wide windows facing the quiet forest where morning light filtered through the trees and made the air feel soft and safe. That room was my sanctuary, the only place in the house where I felt like myself. One evening, I was hanging a new drawing on the wall, a simple sketch of a fox under the moonlight, when Isabel barged in without knocking. She was wearing a smug grin that told me whatever she was about to say was already decided. "Mom says I'm moving up here," she announced, plopping herself onto my bed. This room's bigger. I need the space for my study corner. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. No, I said firmly, voice shaking slightly. This is my room. Isabel only shrugged, already bored with my resistance. Mom said it's better this way. Less than 24 hours later, when I came home from school, the evidence of my eviction was complete. My things, my drawings, my books. Even my handmade paper stars had been moved to the tiny guest room next to the laundry room. My old room now bore Isabel's name on a polished brass plaque taped to the door, packed with new ergonomic furniture, shiny educational posters, and shelves lined with imported study materials. I walked into my new room, a narrow windowless space where the bed touched two walls and the desk barely fit a lamp and a notebook. The air felt colder in there, more foreign. Choking back tears, I went searching for my mother. Mom! I called, finding her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something fragrant. Why would you do this? That was my room. I've had it since I was little. She didn't even turn to face me. You're older now, she said briskly. You should learn to give way. Isabel needs it more. Don't make a scene, Madeline. I stood there rooted to the tile floor, burning with a humiliation that didn't fit into words. I wanted to scream, to shove the pots off the stove, to demand, just once, choose me. But I didn't. I couldn't. I went back to the little room, shut the flimsy door behind me, and sat on the too small bed. Light from the hallway spilled through the crack beneath the door, a pale, ghostly sliver. For the first time, I felt it completely and without denial. In this house, I was not a daughter. I was an afterthought. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, life in the Rhodes household still revolved entirely around Isabel. She was now a top student at an elite private academy in downtown Asheville, chauffeured in a brand new Mercedes SUV, with private tutors cycling through our house like visiting royalty. Every test score of hers was framed. Every debate trophy paraded in front of the neighbors. And me. I still walked to my public high school every morning, balancing textbooks and part-time shifts at the local bookstore. I handled everything on my own: grades, activities, college applications. I never complained. By then, I was used to living outside the glow of the family spotlight. But even the strongest illusions of fairness have a breaking point. I still remember the afternoon I overheard something that stripped away whatever small hope I had left. It was a Tuesday. I had come home early from school and was heading upstairs when I heard soft voices in the kitchen below. Peeking over the banister, I froze. Isabel was standing close to Mom, her voice low and conspiratorial. I mean, Isabel said, twirling a strand of her perfect honey blonde hair. Madeline's grades are fine, I guess. But honestly, most of her teachers just feel sorry for her. That's why she gets those A's. Mom chuckled, the sound like the clink of cold metal. I suspected as much. She said, poor thing tries, but she's just not exceptional. I stood there gripping the railing so hard, my knuckles turned white. I didn't move. I didn't speak because deep down I already knew the truth. In this house, it didn't matter how hard I worked. They only ever heard what they wanted to hear. Still, nothing could have prepared me for the moment when the final brutal verdict was delivered right at the dinner table. That night, Grandpa George and Grandma Margaret came over for dinner. They were the only ones who had ever made me feel seen, heard, valued, for more than just ticking boxes on some invisible checklist. We sat around the old oak table, plates of Mom's lasagna steaming before us. Isabel dominated the conversation, gushing about her acceptance into a prestigious Stanford summer program. That's wonderful, darling. Grandma Margaret beamed, then turned to me, her eyes warm and expectant. And what about you, Madeline? Have you thought about college yet? I straightened up, feeling for the first time in years a flicker of hope that I might get to share something of my own. I applied to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I said, trying to keep the nerves out of my voice. And Georgia Tech, too. I just got accepted into UNC's business program with a partial scholarship. If I can get a little more financial aid, then... I never finished the sentence. Mom set down her fork and knife with a sharp clatter that seemed to slice the air. Madeline, she said, her voice clipped and cold. Your father and I have talked. We can't provide any more help with your tuition this year. I blinked, what? Dad jumped in, his words suspiciously well rehearsed. We have to prioritize Isabel, he said. She's been invited to an Ivy League prep program. It's a rare opportunity. The world around me blurred for a second. So all the college savings you promised were for both of us are going to Isabel. Mom sighed as if explaining something tedious to a stubborn child. Isabel has real potential. You might want to consider starting at a community college and transferring later, she added. Or taking some time off to work isn't a bad option either. Not a bad option. It took everything in me to not laugh or cry. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Only the faint clink of Grandma Margaret's spoon against her plate broke it. Caroline, Grandma said quietly, her voice low but firm. Both girls are my granddaughters. I can't sit here and watch you cast one aside. Mom's lips tightened. Mom, this isn't… Yes, it is. Grandpa George cut in sharply. It absolutely is. Later, while I cleared dishes in the kitchen, Grandma Margaret came over and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. You don't have to carry this burden anymore, she whispered. We'll pay for your tuition, all of it. No loans, no worries. I turned my throat tight, but that's too much. It's not too much, she smiled, her eyes shining. It's an investment in someone who fights, even when the odds aren't fair. You don't need favoritism to shine, Madeline. You already have. That fall, I moved into the dorms at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The morning I left, Caroline barely looked up from her coffee. She gave me a half-hearted hug at the door and muttered, "Be frugal. Don't expect anything from us." Isabel didn't even lift her eyes from her phone. I dragged my suitcase across the cracked front yard path, feeling the old gravel crunch beneath my feet. As the house faded behind me, I realized I wasn't just leaving a building, I was leaving behind years of condescending stares, constant comparisons, and the suffocating feeling of being less. College was a different world. There, I wasn't the forgettable daughter, the backup plan, the invisible shadow behind a self-proclaimed prodigy. I was Madeline Rhodes, a business student with a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for strategy. Professors praised my critical thinking. Classmates sought me out for help with projects and case competitions. Every Saturday night, I called Grandpa George and Grandma Margaret, telling them about every small victory, a paper graded, A+, a mock investment challenge, when a leadership position earned. My parents. They didn't call, they didn't ask how I was doing, and strangely, I wasn't hurt. I no longer needed approval from a place that had never freely offered it. What I had now was something solid, something real, something no one could take from me. Self-worth. By the time I entered my senior year, I moved through the world with a confidence I had never dared to imagine. Late-night study sessions in the library, endless cups of burnt coffee from the corner cafe, and countless hours devouring every investment model I could find online had paid off. People started noticing. One afternoon after class, my finance professor, Dr. Randall, called me aside. "You should apply for this," he said, handing me a flyer for a competitive summer internship at Whitmore and Grant Financial in Atlanta, one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the Southeast. I hesitated, the old fear stirring in my chest, but something stronger, something forged in years of quiet battles rose up and pushed me forward. The day of the interview felt surreal. A glass conference room, a long oak table polished so perfectly it reflected the Atlanta skyline behind me. 3 managers sat across from me, holding my resume like a ticket. They weren't sure they wanted to punch. One of them, a man with salt and pepper hair named Zaylin, leaned forward. "What do you think is the most important factor when creating an investment strategy?" I smiled, steady, understanding. I said, "Not just the data, but the psychology behind it." They exchanged a quick glance, and I knew right then I had nailed it. I got the offer. That summer, everything shifted. After graduating with honors and publishing a research project in a respected financial journal, Whitmore and Grant offered me a full-time position as a junior investment analyst. I dove into the work with everything I had: risk reports, shareholder presentations, deep dives into volatile market charts. I absorbed it all like oxygen. 3 years later, during a routine review of a high net worth client portfolio, I stumbled onto something unsettling. A cluster of tech stocks our firm had heavily invested in showed indicators that didn't align with market behavior. Everyone else saw breakout potential. I saw a trap. 2 sleepless nights later, after combing through appendix reports and tracing transaction trails, the truth emerged. The companies were inflating their revenue figures, buying their own products to fabricate sales. If we stayed in, we'd lose at least $32 million of client money. Silence was not an option. That Monday, I marched into the executive boardroom, my heart pounding against the 42-page risk analysis clutched in my hands. No one interrupted as I presented my findings. When I finished, the CFO sat back stunned and turned to the CEO. "She just saved the company," he said quietly. 3 days later, the portfolio was entirely restructured based on my recommendations. 6 months later, Whitmore and Grant reported an 11.4% growth, its highest in 7 years. I was promoted to lead investment strategist, but I didn't stop there. In the after hours when the building emptied and the city lights flickered outside my office window, I worked on something else, something bigger. A risk scoring model that could predict market behavior based not just on numbers, but on human psychology, media sentiment, and global shifts. The kind of model the old guard said was unquantifiable. I called it PRISM, and it would be the very thing that changed everything. At first, PRISM was just a personal project, a late-night obsession fueled by too many cups of burn-office coffee, and my relentless need to prove that understanding people mattered more than understanding numbers. But after it accurately predicted price swings in 3 major stock groups ahead of critical events, upper management took notice. A year later, PRISM wasn't just my side project anymore. It was the backbone of Whitmore and Grant's core strategy, helping us surpass 2 of our top competitors in the investment sector. I still remember the day they called me into the senior boardroom. The CEO, Douglas Whitmore, smiled as everyone took their seats. "Madeline," he said, "we're creating a new executive position, Chief Strategic Investment Officer, and no one deserves it more than you." I could hardly breathe. Just a few years earlier, I was the girl being told she wasn't exceptional enough. Now I was leading strategies that redefined the firm's future. That night, I didn't celebrate with champagne or an expensive dinner. I drove to Black Mountain, to my grandparents' red brick house, the only place that had ever felt like home. Grandma Margaret was baking lemon bars. Grandpa George was stirring his evening tea. I laid the appointment letter on the kitchen table. They looked at each other and smiled. "Little Madeline," Grandpa said, his voice thick with pride, now leading the way. For the first time, I didn't need validation from anyone, not even them. Because I had already validated myself with quiet grit, relentless effort, and a refusal to let anyone write my ending for me. After accepting the role at Whitmore and Grant, I wanted to mark the moment, not with grandeur, but with a simple, warm gathering. Just my grandparents, a few close friends, and trusted colleagues. When I mentioned the idea to my mother, she immediately jumped in. "You should let us host it," Caroline insisted. "Make it more intimate. Just send the money for catering and decorations. I'll handle the guest list and everything." Against my better judgment, and maybe because part of me still clung to the dream of healing old wounds, I agreed. I transferred $3,500 to her account without asking further questions. A week later, when I arrived at the old Rhodes family house in Hendersonville, my heart sank. The house was decked out like something out of a wedding magazine. White orchids lined the staircases, gold ribbons dangled from every chandelier, and the scent of truffle oil and imported French cheeses filled the air. I spotted Grandpa George and Grandma Margaret by the bar, chatting with a few distant relatives. And then, descending the grand staircase in a stunning red satin dress, was Isabel holding the arm of a tall, polished man I didn't recognize. As the guests gathered, I raised my glass ready to speak, ready to finally claim my moment. But my mother beat me to it. Standing proudly in front of everyone, she beamed. "Dear family," she announced, "we're here today not just to reconnect, but to celebrate something truly special." She turned dramatically toward Isabel. Isabel and her boyfriend Brandon are officially engaged. Cheers erupted around the room. I stood frozen champagne glass midair. I turned toward my mother, seeking some sign, some acknowledgement, but her eyes passed over me like I was nothing more than a piece of furniture. I stepped forward, mouth opening, but before I could speak, my father intercepted me. He gripped my wrist, his voice a low growl. "Don't ruin this. Walk away if you don't consider yourself cut off. No contact, no inheritance." I stared at him, this man who had once looked at me like a faulty equation, and slowly peeled his hand off my arm. "No, not this time." I returned to the center of the room, raised my champagne glass higher, and spoke calm and clear. "Excuse me, everyone. May I have a moment?" The room fell into a thick, uneasy silence. Isabel paused mid-laugh. My mother's face hardened into stone. "This gathering," I said, voice unwavering, "was planned to celebrate a major milestone in my life. I was recently appointed Chief Strategic Investment Officer at Whitmore and Grant Financial, one of the top firms in Atlanta." I paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "I'm the one who paid for this event. Every flower, every dish, every drop of champagne. My mother agreed to organize it, and never once mentioned it would be turned into an engagement party." Murmurs rippled through the guests. Grandpa George and Grandma Margaret stood silently, their faces taut. "I'm not against Isabel's engagement." I continued, my gaze never leaving my mother's. "But I refuse to stay silent while my own family once again tries to erase me just like they did my entire childhood." Across the room, Brandon turned to Isabel, confusion clouding his face. "You told me this was just a casual family gathering," he said, voice rising. Isabel flushed red. I was going to tell you after, by using your sister's money to throw yourself a party," he said, his voice thick with disgust. He set his glass down sharply and walked toward the door. Isabel scrambled after him, her heels clicking frantically on the polished wood, but he didn't even turn back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then from near the staircase, I heard a soft tut of disapproval. "Honestly," my Aunt Lorraine muttered just loud enough for a few to hear, "it's natural. A daughter getting engaged is a bigger deal." Others nodded in agreement, murmuring excuses and shifting uncomfortably. But before the shame could settle on me, a different voice rang out clear, sharp. "Enough, Caroline." It was Uncle Rick, one of my father's older brothers. He stood pointing toward me. "She's not the one who should be ashamed tonight. Madeline paid for this whole event out of generosity, not to be humiliated. She doesn't owe you silence anymore." A ripple of tension cracked through the room. "Maybe it's time," Uncle Rick added, voice cold, "for the Rhodes family to stop pretending that favoritism is the same as love." My father's face turned a dangerous shade of red. My mother clutched at her wine glass like it was a lifeline. But I didn't wait for their protests. I turned to my grandparents. Their eyes filled with fierce pride met mine. "I don't need the rest of this family to know who I am," I said, voice steady. "I know it myself now." And I walked out the front door, the same door I had once left in tears. But this time my head was high, my spine straight, and my heart finally free. Brandon left the house without a word, leaving behind Isabel's stunned, panicked face and a room drowning in a thick, breathless silence. She chased after him, her heels clacking frantically across the hardwood floor, but the slam of the car door and the disappearing Mercedes taillights told the rest of the story. When Isabel turned back inside, her face was flushed, not with sadness, but with rage. "You've always been jealous of me," she screamed across the room. "You can't stand it when I'm happy. You have to ruin everything." I stood there still and silent. For the first time, her words didn't slice into me. They didn't even reach me. I wasn't hurt, just tired so deeply, tired of the same broken record spinning blame without end. Before I could speak, Grandma Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but edged in steel. "You made your choices, Isabel," she said. "Don't dump the consequences on your sister." My mother, pale with fury and embarrassment, stormed forward. "Madeline," she hissed, voice trembling. "Who do you think you are, humiliating your sister in front of the entire family?" I met her gaze steadily. "I don't need to think," I said quietly. "I just told the truth, and I've stayed silent long enough." My father grabbed my mother's hand, holding her back, but his eyes burned with rage. "If you walk out of here today," he said, voice like ice, "you're no longer part of this family. Don't expect an inheritance. Don't expect anything from us ever again. As far as we're concerned, you never existed." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Grandpa George finally moved. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. "Thomas," he said loud and clear, "if you're going to threaten Madeline with being cut out of the family, then it's time the rest of this family hears the full truth." Grandma Margaret moved to stand beside him, taking his hand firmly. My mother turned, sensing the shift. Her face lost all color. "We updated our will 3 months ago," Grandma Margaret said, her voice terrifyingly even. "The entire estate, the house, the savings, the investment shares, all of it will go to Madeline." Gasps rippled across the room. My mother let out a choked, furious gasp. "What?" she barked. "How could you?" Grandpa George took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes locked on my mother's. "Because Madeline is not just our granddaughter," he said. "5 years ago, she saved this entire family, and none of you even knew." A stunned hush fell over the room. "When Thomas," Grandpa continued, voice heavy with quiet disappointment, "planned to invest nearly all of the family's trust fund into a can't-miss tech venture. It was Madeline, barely out of college, who flagged it. She did the research, uncovered the fraud, and stopped it. If she hadn't, there would be nothing left here to fight over." My father's face turned gray. My mother stumbled back a step, mouth opening and closing like a beached fish. "You were willing to risk everything," Grandpa George said, his voice rising slightly. "Everything your parents built, everything we built. And when Madeline saved it, you didn't thank her. You didn't even acknowledge her." Tears pricked at my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming release of truth finally being spoken out loud. "We don't reward deceit," Grandma Margaret said, her voice firm. "We don't reward selfishness or entitlement or cruelty. Madeline didn't demand anything from us. She never did, and that's exactly why she deserves everything." Across the room, Isabel crumpled into a chair, sobbing into her hands. Her red dress pooled around her like a broken flag. My mother stood frozen in the center of the room, her lips trembling, as if trying to find some angle to spin the situation back into her control, but there was none. My father turned away silent. I clutched my purse tightly, looking at my grandparents, at the two people who had seen me, believed in me, fought for me when no one else did. "I never asked for this," I whispered throat thick. "We know," Grandpa said, smiling softly, "and that's exactly why you deserve it more than anyone." Around us, the relatives who had once fawned over Isabel began rising quietly from their chairs, awkward and shamed, avoiding my gaze as they shuffled toward the exits. No one tried to stop me as I turned to leave. I glanced back once at the house where I'd once been a shadow, then at the proud, steady faces of the only family that mattered. The house wasn't a wound anymore. It was a grave, and I had finally completely walked away from it. I stepped outside, the spring night air, cool against my flushed skin. The familiar scent of apple blossoms from the backyard drifted toward me, soft and bittersweet. Behind me, I heard the door click shut. Not a slam, not a final act of anger. Just the quiet sound of a chapter ending, a lifetime of endurance quietly folding closed. On the drive back to Black Mountain, nestled among the gentle Carolina hills, Grandma Margaret reached across the console and gently took my hand. "You don't have to fight to prove yourself anymore, Madeline," she said. "Now you get to just be." I looked at her, my eyes burning, not from pain, but from the overwhelming lightness washing through me. For the first time, I wasn't running from shame. I wasn't chasing a love that had always been conditional. For the first time, I had chosen myself over their approval, and it felt like breathing real air after a lifetime underwater. 3 years have passed since that night. The night I walked out of that hollow house for the last time, carrying nothing but the truth, the scars and the strength I had built when no one was looking. I never went back. And not once, not even for a second, did I miss it. In those 3 years, I poured myself into my work at Whitmore and Grant Financial. Every pre-dawn morning, every silent evening spent on the 32nd floor, watching the skyline of Atlanta flicker against the dark. There I was, refining strategies, tweaking the PRISM algorithm, leading my team through economic storms that would have crushed less resilient firms. I wasn't surviving anymore, I was building. When Douglas Whitmore announced his retirement, few dared to guess who would succeed him. It wasn't luck when he chose me. It was every quiet decision I had made, the late nights no one saw the risks, no one else dared take, the integrity that never bowed to convenience. At 30 years old, I stood on the main hall stage, camera lights flashing all around me, becoming the youngest female CEO in the firm's 65-year history. I didn't stand there to impress anyone. I stood there because I had earned it without shortcuts, without permission. After the ceremony, when the crowd thinned and the clamor faded, I stepped into a quiet corner and pulled out my phone. I called my grandparents. I did it, I whispered, voice thick with emotion. On the other end, Grandpa George let out a proud, booming laugh. And Grandma Margaret, with the same gentle certainty that had carried me through the darkest nights, said the words I would always carry. You've always been worthy, Madeline, from the very first day. Meanwhile, 40 miles away in Hendersonville, life hadn't changed much. Isabel, now 27, no longer wore the engagement ring that once sparkled on her hand after Brandon left that night. Her life unraveled with quiet inevitability. She dropped out of a trendy fashion course blaming too much pressure, tried launching herself as a content creator, but quit after a few months lamenting that no one gets my style. Eventually, she moved back in with my parents, into the same room she once took from me, the same room they had once declared she needed more. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the night I walked out. Sometimes my grandparents mentioned hearing through mutual friends that they'd asked about me, but I didn't care. I had learned something critical. Not every relationship is meant to survive, especially the ones built on denial, selfishness, and carefully crafted illusions. Every Sunday afternoon, I visit Grandpa George and Grandma Margaret. We toast homemade bread, we flip through old photo albums I once thought would only bring pain, but now somehow bring smiles. Grandma still tells silly stories from my childhood, and Grandpa pretends not to remember the details, just so I'll have to tell them all over again. One afternoon, while we sat on the porch swing watching the sun sink behind the mountains, I asked them, "Do you ever regret leaving everything to me?" Grandma Margaret squeezed my hand. "We didn't leave it because of what it was worth," she said. "We left it to the one who understood value not in money, but in choice. The one who chose integrity over convenience. The one who chose silence when it protected others and voice when it mattered." I smiled through the lump in my throat because deep down I already knew their real gift wasn't the estate. It was faith. Faith that I would never let the weight of the past define me. One crisp spring afternoon, after a global strategy meeting, I stepped out into the lobby and froze. Standing near the entrance, looking lost and out of place in her polished heels and designer coat, was Isabel. She spotted me and straightened immediately, putting on the same brittle mask she had worn all her life. "I'm not here to apologize," she blurted out, arms crossing like a shield. I just want to know how you're doing so well without anyone lifting you up." I looked at her, feeling nothing, not anger, not pity, just a sad kind of understanding. "Because I once had nothing, Isabel," I said simply, and that's when I learned how to stand on my own. She stared at me for a long, hollow moment. Her mouth opened-closed, but no words came out. Finally, she turned and walked away. And I didn't call after her, because I knew without a doubt that I would never go back to being the sister who yielded, who endured, who swallowed her voice, just to keep an uneasy peace. I turned back toward the elevators, toward my team, my future, my life. No matter where the path starts, if you never abandon yourself, the destination will always be worth it. My story isn't just about overcoming favoritism. It's about reclaiming worth, quietly, steadily, fiercely. I was once the girl forgotten in her own celebration. But I chose to rise not out of spite, but out of truth and dignity. Today, I no longer seek validation from those who couldn't see me. I have found my place among those who do. And more importantly, I have learned to see myself. Madeline Rhodes did not choose hatred. She chose freedom. She didn't choose to keep carrying the weight of a family that only knew how to take her love for granted. She chose a new path, one where her self-worth would always come first. If you've ever sacrificed without being appreciated, if you've ever felt betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you, you are not alone. Share your story in the comments below. I'll be reading every single one because every voice deserves to be heard. Comment 6. If you're also walking the path of healing and reclaiming yourself. And if today's story touched your heart, please like the video. Subscribe to the channel and join us on more journeys of awakening growth and inner strength. Remember this: you don't need your family's permission to live a life that honors you. You only need to believe in yourself. Thank you for being here today. I can't wait to see you in the next story.